Good evening. Because we are pressed for time usually when we do the study that we're starting, we decided to do the same schedule we do on Wednesday nights, in which we do one song and a prayer, and then we go right into class. And so we'll do that. Just the one thing is there won't be a bell to tell me to stop. I'll just gauge that on my own. But I'll try to be pretty timely about that. But at any rate, just wanted to let you know that. So we're going to try to give the most amount of time to our class that we're able to do. I want to mention to you, again, a couple things as we're going through this study of the big picture. And I know that the book itself we will reference and look at, but the big picture is the Bible, the big picture of the Bible. And that's the focus. That's what this is all about. In fact, that is what we're trying to learn more about. The big picture, the book that we're using, is simply a tool to help us do that. Our study is going to be textually based, and we're going to focus on what the Bible says. And this book just simply breaks it down into pieces that are easy for us to digest in one lesson. And so that is what we are looking at. And so that's what we're going to do. Just if you're watching us online and aren't aware, the big picture is written by Mark Hines, and it is published by 21st Century Christian. If you want to get your own copy of that and look at it, certainly recommend that for you to do to give us a good study aid for what we're looking at and for just your general study of the Bible. But tonight, our lesson is the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And the title in the book is Before Abraham Was. And I really like that because that is taken from a statement from Jesus Christ. Jesus was asked about who he was and where he came from, and he told the leaders of the people in John chapter 8, verse 58, when they were ridiculing him and such, he says, before Abraham was, I am. And of course, that goes very well with the I am passages that Andy's been speaking to us with. And of course, I did a couple of the I am passages before he started on that, and he's just taking off of the ones that I'd done as well. And so in looking at that and that concept, that before Abraham was, I am. Now we find Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And so the time of Scripture that was before Abraham is chapters 1 through 11. So I think it's a perfect title for this lesson tonight. And it is these first 11 chapters of the Bible. You will know that the book of Genesis is it's a very important, significant book. It covers the entire time of the patriarchal age, which the patriarchal age is just simply the name we give to before the time of Moses. Moses comes on the scene in the beginning of Exodus, and Moses comes and the law of Moses, the Old Covenant law that is given to him on Mount Sinai, comes in the book of Exodus. And so the period of time that goes before that is what we call the patriarchal age. The reason why it's called the patriarchal age is because God spoke to the patriarchs, the leaders of the families. And so he would speak to them, give them the guidance, give them the knowledge that they needed, and they would either do or not do what he said. Thankfully, most of them did what he said. And that is generally the book of Genesis. Tonight, we're going to look at, like I said, those first 11 chapters. The author of our book breaks that then into 5 stories. And I think very well he does that. So we're going to follow that format, but we're going to add a 6th one in that I think is very good to add into it as well. The first one of the 5 stories, if you will, that we're going to look at is the creation. in Genesis chapter 1. We find out in the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 1, verse 1, in the very first verse of the Bible, it says, "In the beginning, God." Now think about the significance of that. In the beginning, God. It tells us when and who. A couple of the great questions of humanity as to when. Now, when beginning, as far as time, date, such, we don't have that information. But as far as our frame of reference, God created in the beginning. And so in the beginning tells us when, and of course tells us who. The power that God gave by being God, by being all-knowing, by being the creator, is what he puts into place. You know, everything is created. You know, some of you here at Barrickville are really good craftsmen. Some of you can paint. You know, we've got some artists among us. Some can work in wood. Some can work in other things. And you can do amazing things with that, and you can manipulate that and take those raw products and make them into something really special or really awesome. And some of you are very creative. Well, to have something intelligently designed, there needs to be an intelligent designer. Someone with some skill, with some knowledge, that is able to use that to manipulate those things to make the end product. And I don't see how anybody could look at the universe that we are in and look at the sun, the moon, the stars, look at a place like West Virginia where we live, look at the trees, and you know, we all know it's going to happen. You know, unless the Lord comes back in 2 or 3 weeks, it's going to be awesome around here. It's going to be beautiful. The yellows, the oranges, the reds. It's going to look like the hillsides are on fire from the different leaf colors. And just beautiful to take a look at that tapestry that we're going to be able to see in just a few weeks, and think about that, and then think about our own selves, our own human bodies, and how intricate and awesomely we are designed. And to see all of that and think that happened from some explosion randomly out there in space billions of years ago. That makes no sense. I've seen a couple explosions and nothing good came out unless you're trying to remove a stump. You know, explosions don't make anything other than mess. And so to think that idea, and you know, and they attack billions. You know, when I went to school, you know, you can say on one hand that's a lot of years ago. In some ways you can say it's not so many years. But the Earth was only about 5 billion years old when I went to school. It's grown 15 billion since then. I don't know how that happened. You know, but the textbooks have added many, many billions to the age of the earth in that amount of time. And so, you know, if they can't figure it out, they just tack a few more billions on. It's all that happens. It's that simple. And really that's not it. The Bible is here to tell us to tell us what happened and to give us that guidance. Now, not all our questions are going to get asked or answered by Genesis chapter 1. There's a lot of things we don't know. You know, we're not told how God created everything other than he spoke and it happened. And so the Bible, especially Genesis chapter 1, is not God's how-to book to create a universe. You know, it was never designed to be that. If you could follow and understand God's how-to book to create a universe, you could create your own universe. But it doesn't work that way. God's the creator of the universe. He is the designer and the intelligent being behind all of those things. Just simply when we read the first book, or excuse me, the first chapter of Genesis, what we find out is that God simply did it. On page 13 in our big picture book, he has listed some of the things that are creation, that creation was brought about. I know a lot of our children learn this in Bible class. Our 4 and 5 and 2 and 3 year old, I know that they go through that. In fact, they're going through that right now in the 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 year old classes. You know, on day one, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. On the second day, you know, God made the formless earth, the oceans, the atmosphere around that, the earth that was unformed. Interestingly enough, in verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. We are introduced not only to God in verse 1, but we are introduced to God's Spirit in verse 2. And we're going to look later on tonight, later in our study, that Jesus Christ is there in creation as well. And so, very much, God is in verse 1, His Spirit is in verse 2, and then we're going to realize that Jesus Christ was there in verses 1 and 2 as well. And so they complete what we think of as, for lack of a better term, Godhead, of God the Father and the Son and the Spirit, are all there right in the very beginning of creation. And so on day one, God made light. Day two, He made the oceans and the atmosphere. Day three, from the earth comes the land, the dry land. And because dry land appears, there's the part that's not land, and of course that's the seas that we see up on our planet. Also, from that came the plants and the trees. On day 4, God made the sun and moon and the stars and those things that we see in the sky. On day 5, He made the fish and the birds. And on day 6, He made all the animals and the human beings at the end of that day. You know, there's a lot that's said sometimes by people to say, well, we don't know how long those days are. Well, in Genesis, they're called an evening and a morning, and there's the first day. They are treated in Genesis 1 as actual days with a morning and an evening, and done treated that way in the text. And so, to take the Word at its word, and to take God at His word, that God created those things in what we would think of as 24-hour or thereabout days, and in doing that. Also, you know, if there were eons of time between those days, then there's some problems that would result. Like, for instance, if the plants are created on day 3 and the sun is not created till day 4, there's a problem. Because plants get food from photosynthesis due to the sun. Also, a big portion of plants on our planet are they reproduce by bees and hummingbirds and other things that pollinate them. Well, the pollinators, the bees, are going to come about on day 6 with the animals, and the hummingbirds, they're going to be on day 5, and other pollinators. So the pollinators of the plants are going to come on other days. And so if there are thousands of years even between those days, there's a problem. A lot of those plants are not going to be able to be perpetuated. The clearest, easiest thing to understand is that it means what it says and says what it means, and that is God created in individual days. You know, if God can speak and light can exist, and God can speak and the sun and moon and stars can exist, He can do it inside one day. And there's no need to go anywhere. There's no need to look at it in any other way. You know, creating an earth is difficult enough, you know, for God to create an earth that is that appears to be old by, having dirt and other things here is not a problem for him to do. And so to look and to say that things are old because something carbon dates to a certain date really is to ignore the fact that God would have created stones and they would have had some level of carbon within them. And anyway, it just makes no sense to look at it that way. And instead, it's so much easier to understand that God created the heavens and the earth. And well, there are studies in which we can put a lot more time into that, and certainly we can do that. And if anyone has any questions or comments about that, we can certainly entertain those later on. After God created everything in chapter 1, in chapters 2 and 3, we find the beginning story of Adam and Eve. And we see that Adam and Eve are different. In our about teen class this morning, they wanted to talk about abortion. So we talked about that today. The first place I took us to in that study was here in Genesis 1, in which it shows about God creating man in his own image. And he says, in the image of God, he created them, verse 27. And so God created mankind in his image. The animals, the things of this earth, were never created in God's image. But mankind was. And so, created in mankind because made in his likeness. That doesn't mean we physically look like God. But instead, God is a spirit. And God is a spirit being. We're told in John 4:24 that God is a spirit and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. And God is a spirit being. We are made with a soul, with a spirit. We are going to forever exist after we begin existing. And that way we're going to be like God, because we're always going to continue to exist when we come into this world. And so we have a spirit within us that is, from the point we start, from then on, it is eternal. And it's in that way that we're created like God. And so Adam and Eve in chapters 2 and 3 are different than the animals. They're different in all kinds of ways. They have intellect beyond them. They have a spirit beyond the animals. Adam and Eve are able to communicate with God on a daily basis. God would come down in the cool of the evening and visit with them and talk with them, and they were able to be together. And so he didn't do that with the horses. He didn't do that with the cats and the dogs. He did that with Adam and Eve because they were different. They were created in God's image and no one else or nothing else was. And so God created them, put them in the garden, and gave them the opportunity to rule over, have dominion over the animals that were there. Adam and Eve were given a choice and given an opportunity. And this kind of comes down to why they would have been created. And that was to serve God and to acknowledge God. And to acknowledge God as their creator. And to acknowledge God as their God. And so they were given a choice by God to either obey him or not obey him. They were given one rule. And remember what that one was. What was that? Yeah, they could not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They were allowed to eat from anything else, but not that one tree. And so they were given that one law. Well, Satan comes to them. We see in in the beginning of chapter 3, Satan is called the serpent in this text, and he's more crafty than the other beasts of the field. And he comes to them and says to them at the end of verse 1, did God actually say to you, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And in verse 2, the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God has said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it lest you die. Now one thing you'll notice, God did say, do not eat of that tree. But God didn't say, you shall not touch it. Now, touching it was probably an unwise thing, but it was not what God had said. They had added that law, that rule, to what God had said. But at any rate, the serpent got them to look at that tree, played on their pride to get them to be, well, we can be like God if we know good and evil. They looked at that because they saw it was something good to eat, and they decided that they would eat that so they could be like God and they could understand like God. And so the serpent tempted them in all the ways that they could be tempted, with their eyes, by looking at it, looking good, by pride of life, by the fact that they would be wise in their own eyes, wise before God, and that the flesh, it was something that tasted good, something that they desired. And so they did that, and you remember what happens. They eat of that tree, and just like anything else you do that you know you shouldn't do it, it's not nearly as good in the aftermath. When it's all over with, it's not nearly what you thought it would be. And so now that they eat this fruit, their eyes are opened, and all of a sudden they understand a lot of things they don't want to understand. They realize some things that they were better off not to know. And their ignorance was blissful. But now they realize that they themselves are naked, and so they make some clothing with fig leaves. They put those together, and they make, in verse 7 of chapter 3, some loincloths to cover up themselves. And they hide away from God when they hear God coming down in the next verse. And they do, and they hide from the presence of the Lord. And, they're kind of new to it all. But how well does hiding from God go? Nobody's able to hide from God. No one's able to do that. We looked also today in our Bible class with the teens, we looked at the 139th Psalm, and David said, if I go to the heights, or I go to the bottom of the sea, you're there, you see me. And then he says, you saw me even before I was born, and how I was made, how I was fearfully and wonderfully made, and that God was able to see and know David even before birth. And of course, the point of that is that God forms, a person inside, and God designed us to be that way. And so if God knows us before we're born, then that unborn baby has great value and is acknowledged and understood by God. And so we should treat it accordingly. Well, David says all those things. I can't hide from you. Anywhere I go, I'm in your presence, or you're in my presence. And so they realize that they've sinned, and they try to hide from God. And God confronts them about that. And they find out that they've sinned, and that they are going to make the story short, they're banished from the garden. The tree of life is removed from them. And from that point on, they have to work. They have to work to provide for themselves. The woman, Eve, from then has to have children and have pain in childbirth. And from then on, they are separated out from the garden. And now they have to go and do the things that they need to do to take care of themselves, to raise their family, and much like the way that we would have to do. And so they have to go and do that. And so that is the second story, the first one being creation, the second one being about Adam and Eve, and how that they were put in the garden and everything was perfect, and yet they broke the one commandment that God gave, and they committed that sin by eating that tree. And you find in verse 15 of chapter 3, the very first prophecy of the Bible. And that prophecy in chapter 3, verse 15 says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. And he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And of course, he's saying that people and snakes are going to have their run-ins from now on. And many of us probably have had a run-in with a snake. And some of you are terrified of snakes. I will tell you, we have 3 elders that if we had a snake infestation, they probably wouldn't be at the front in that, because I know they're all 3 that way. I heard one time I was out here doing whatever, and I could hear them. They were making all kind of noise. Went in there and talking. They were talking snake stories. So anyway, but so that's not probably their favorite thing, and it's not really a lot of our favorite thing to think about snakes and that, because there's always that. But the real prophecy matters that their head's going to be crushed, because it's more so than just snakes in general. Satan is going to be destroyed. His head is going to be crushed by Jesus. He is going to be victorious over them, and there's going to be this enmity between humans and snakes. But understand this battle is going to take place, but Satan is going to crush the serpent's head. And so we need to recognize that. Okay. The next one of the stories that we see in our lesson is in chapter 4. And this one is the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel are the 2 first sons that Adam and Eve have. And Cain and Abel are going to offer a sacrifice. And they're told this. We see this in the first couple verses of chapter 4. In verse 2, again, she bore a brother Abel. Of course, this right after Cain. And Abel was a keeper of the sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought the firstborn of his flock, and out of their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain offered a sacrifice from his garden, if you will, from the produce of his field. And Abel offered from his flocks. God was happy with Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. And we're not told exactly why. We're not told if it was because they were told what they needed to offer and Cain didn't follow that, or maybe it was an attitude thing or whatever. We're not told. We really aren't. And so I don't want to speculate, but whatever it was, Cain didn't offer in a way that God wanted. He did not do what God had asked. He did not do what God expected. And so God was wanting to give him the opportunity to change that. Instead, he became upset. He became envious, he became jealous, and he killed his brother Abel. They were out in the field together, and he takes a stone and kills his brother. And then after that, God comes to him and says, where's your brother? And that very famous line, am I my brother's keeper? Comes about, and of course, God knew what he had done. And Cain was banished to leave that area. And God put a mark upon him to make sure that others will not harm him as the result of that. And of course, that's what happened. You find the first murder. You find what sin brings about. Maybe Cain had the best of intentions. We don't know. But when you don't do things God's way, bad things result. And Cain is a great example of, if you make a mistake, you want to own up to it You want to acknowledge that and change it. Instead, he compounded his mistakes by making more mistakes, by the biggest one, killing his brother Abel, and the things that he did as a result of that. And so we must learn to acknowledge, answer our mistakes first, correct them, repent of them, and do better. Then you find the next section of Scripture that we find. We see chapters 6 through 9. In chapters 6 through 9, we find Noah and his flood. That's one of the most recognizable stories in all the Bible, so I don't want to spend a lot of time of it. But we know that the people have become evil. In chapter 5, which is not included in that, we have the genealogy of the people. And during that time, there's a whole lot of bad people in there. One exception that is mentioned specifically. That exception is Enoch. In fact, we're going to have a handout in a few minutes, and I have Enoch added in there. That's the sixth person, the sixth story that I add in there into my telling of this. But Enoch in Genesis 5, verses 21 to 24 is all we know about him. It says that he lived for 65 years. He fathered Methuselah, and it says Enoch walked with God, and after he fathered Methuselah for 300 years and had other sons and daughters, and he walked with God and was no more because God took him. And so we don't know anything about him other than he walked with God all of his days and that God took him home. And so Enoch is one of the two individuals, Elijah being the other, that we find out that never died, that we have recorded in Scripture, and that he walked with God and was no longer. He had apparently the kind of relationship that Adam and Eve had. But yet, it came after that point. And so we don't know that much about Enoch, but what a great little account there. Because you know what? God took him, and so undoubtedly they went and looked for him. And they went and they tried to find him, and they couldn't find him. And you can imagine how that would be. You know, because his family would have missed him. Could you imagine? You know, that here you have this leader in the family, this patriarch, and he goes out for a walk one day and never returns. You'd look for him a while, wouldn't you? You'd look for him. You'd search for him. But yet he never comes back, and you realize it's because God took him. And so what a neat thing that is. In chapters 6 through 9, as we've already mentioned, Noah's flood takes place. Because with the exception of like Enoch and some others, the world has become very corrupt, become very evil. And God decides he is done with it. He's ready to destroy everything except for Noah and his family. The earth is that corrupt. God, in essence, hits the reset button. You know, it's amazing how much a reset button can do. We probably all in today's day and time, you know, have electronics. Maybe you have a smartphone. Maybe you have an iPad or a computer or whatever. If you ever call technical support, you know what the first thing they're going to tell you is, have you shut it off and turned it back on? That'll be the first thing. Anytime I've ever talked with anybody that knew anything about electronics, that's the first thing they say to you. Have you shut it down and turned it back on? And the reason is, there's just something about electronics. You know, I get into a brain fog sometimes. Do you? And sometimes I get to, the point that I like, wow, I just need to, my thing I've said to Amy thousands of times. She's out of town tonight. She's okay. She's in South Carolina. They had our daughter-in-law's baby shower today. But I've told her thousands of times over the years, I've had about all today I can stand. That's usually about one of my parting words before going to bed. I've had just about as much fun today as I can stand. And usually it's because, I'm tired, I'm weary, my mind's been stressed or stretched or whatever, and I'm just kind of ready. I'm ready to hit that reset button. and I'm ready to hit that reset button and wake up tomorrow and let the sun come back up and start over. And you know how life is. Most of the time it's better when you get back up the next day. And so that reset button, God did a very hard reset with Noah because the people had become so wicked and had done so many things. God said, we're going to start over. And he started over with Noah and his family. We find out that there were 8 people in that ark with him: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. And that was it. 8 people that started out everything again. And so from there, God reset everything. Once they came out of the ark, after the flood covered the earth, after everything was done, they came out and they began to settle the land again. And God gave them the command to multiply and replenish the earth. The same kind of command that God gave to Adam and Eve in the beginning. And so they did. In chapter 10, you'll find a lot of names. You'll find the genealogy from Noah and his sons down for a while. And we'll not look at those, but there's a lot of names there, a lot of interesting things there. But that's what happens, that these people came about. And the neat thing is that even though we don't know anything about them, their names are there. And their names are there, and those names, they're not just random things. They're real people that lived and died in that time, and they are able to be there on the earth. Well, once the population built up, once they had some people together, they decided to stay in one place, and God had told them to fill up the earth. And they couldn't do that, stay in one place. And so they opted to stay together. And how they decided to do that, they decided an ambitious building project to build a tower that would go up into heaven, and they would be able to go up and reach to God. Well, they were never going to be able to reach it that high. If we could shoot a space shuttle and send it tens of thousands of miles out there and not end up in heaven, in God's heaven, they were hopelessly behind on getting there with a tower that they were going to build with brick and mortar. And so we know that God's heaven is not even in the world that we see, that God's in the spirit world and not a place that we can look at in the night sky. But God wanted them to not do that because it went against everything he tried to get them to do. He wanted them to go and fill up the earth and become what the earth is today. And so he confused their languages. If you can't communicate, you can't work together. And so God changed their languages and gave them a difference in languages. And because of that, they found other people that spoke their language, and they spread out, and they went and did their thing all around the world. And so, let's review 5 stories in this section of the first 11 chapters in Genesis. The first story, the creation. God created. All right? We recognize that. What's the second one? What's the second one about? The second one was Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve. Creation, Adam and Eve. What's the third one? Cain and Abel. What's the fourth one? Noah, yeah. Fourth one's Noah. What's the fifth one? Tower of Babel. I included in that, maybe Enoch, but we'll just go with the 5 that he has there. The book of Genesis begins with creation. It talks about Adam and Eve and the fall of mankind in chapter 3. Then we see that, Cain and Abel. There's the story of Cain and Abel. Then we have Noah, and then we have the Tower of Babel. Do you know that if you add to those 5 stories, the next person that comes up in Genesis chapter 12, which is Abraham, that if you take Abraham, and we know Abraham's son, don't we? Isaac, and then the other son, the main son of Isaac is Jacob. And then you realize that the rest of the book of Genesis is about Jacob's sons, in particular Joseph. Then if you take that right there, creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, Babel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, that is the outline of the book of Genesis. Right there. We've got 2 more weeks in Genesis, okay? So I want to drive that point home really well. I want you to get that progression right there. And I want, by the time we've got 2 more weeks, I want to, by the time we're done with that, I want everybody to be able to say, those right there together, that, you have creation, you have Adam and Eve, you have Cain and Abel, you have Noah, Babel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. That's the book of Genesis. Now, I realize that there are stories related to each of them. There's 13 chapters almost on Joseph. But a lot of times we know those stories. We understand those stories because we grew up with them in Bible class. What I want to give to you is a place to hang those stories so that you know who came when and who came in the middle of those. That's one of the things I really like about this book that is very, very good. Something you may not realize, the title page of this lesson, if you'll look at the title page, there is up at the top a timeline. And, sometimes I'm not sure about the specifics of the dates, but he rounds those dates. And you'll notice that if you can get that timeline, it will help you immensely in understanding the story of the Bible. That what we just looked at was before Abraham was. Then you look at where the promises that are given to Abraham, the slavery in Egypt, and you'll notice all the way across that. We're going to build that timeline. That timeline on there is going to be built over the 15 weeks that we're studying this. And so anyway, that comes up at the beginning of those lessons. And so you can look at that and see all of those together. Okay, real quick, I'm going to have Craig pass out our handout. Don't have time to really look at it tonight, but one of the things I think is very important, I'll tell you what, I'll do it as my invitation on Wednesday night, but go ahead and pass out the papers, yeah. But one of the things I have at the bottom of the supplemental stuff I give to you is the link between Jesus Christ and creation, and I'll cover that then. But Jesus was a full partner in creation, and we find that in Scripture. And like I say, I'll save that for my comments Wednesday night. But you have this that is given there, and you find out that all those things, that Jesus is a partner in that creation and a part of that all the way through. So, just to note, like I said, there's some supplemental things on that. I've put this, if you're watching at home, it is on our private Facebook page for the church. If you are not on our private Facebook page and would like to get the supplemental things and the word search that I pass out, if you would like to get that, send an email to that email address that we give out anytime. What's that? It's on the website? Okay. The handout's on the website? Okay. Dane just told me that we've got the handout on the website too. So we're putting it there as well. So if you're watching somewhere, anywhere on the planet, you can get our handout. It's on our church website, barrickvillechurch.com. You can find that. And so anyway, just to note to you, Paul Hott was the one person I chose. So Paul, not Hott, but Paul is in our puzzle. If you give to me, either by showing to me in person or texting and whatever, that you finished up the puzzle, if you'll do that by Wednesday, I'll put you in the drawing to be in next week's puzzle. Okay. And I'm not doing that. Are you doing that, Dane? Good, okay. As long as you're doing it. All right. I want to go through the questions real quick in the back of the lesson. The fill in the blank ones, real quick, everybody, because we've got a smaller group anyway. After Adam and Eve sinned, God enacted a plan to save mankind. How does Genesis 3:15 relate to this plan? That's the verse about the snake, about that the snake would strike the seed of man's heel, the seed of woman's heel, but he would crush their head. And of course, we understand that's Jesus Christ is going to be promised. What was so special about Noah that God picked him to build the ark? Yeah, he was righteous and he found grace in the eyes of God. I didn't mention that, but yeah, that's in there. According to Genesis 7:16, who closed the door of the ark? God did. Okay? After the flood was over, Noah sent a raven out once and a dove twice out of the ark. By doing this, what was he trying to determine? Yeah, if the flood waters are gone. All right? What does the rainbow signify? God's promise to not destroy the earth again by water. When people use the rainbow for their purposes, that's very that's blasphemous, just to be honest about it. That's what it is. You know, God gave the rainbow to be a beautiful thing, to be a wonderful thing. And anyway, number 6. What role did jealousy play in Cain's murder of Abel? What lesson can we learn from this today? What's that? He killed his brother. Do you remember why he killed his brother, Parker? That's right. He was jealous of him. He killed his brother because he was jealous of him. You can hear that too. He knows that he's jealous. Do you remember why he was jealous? That's right. Abel's sacrifice was acceptable to God, and that's very good, Parker. Yeah, very good. Of course, our kids can learn so much, and they do so much, and so we need to realize that. Great job. What role? Oh, because that's what I just did. Number 7. God created man in his own image, but not animals. How is that significant? We're his children. We're made in his image, and the animals are not. You know, we treat animals differently than we treat people. People are always need to be treated better because we're all created in God's image. All right. The questions over on the other side, the multiple choice. Like I say, everybody shout out the answer. When tempting Eve in the Garden of Eden, the devil acted through what animal? Serpent. In fulfillment of Genesis 3:15, Satan bruised the heel of Jesus by means of the crucifixion. See. Jesus crushed the head of Satan by means of the resurrection. He rose from the grave to defeat Satan. How did God punish mankind for building the Tower of Babel? Confuse their languages. The earth and everything in it was created by God in 6 days. Could have made it a trick question and said 7, but it was 6 days. After they sinned and God came looking for them, how did Adam and Eve react? They hid from God, and that didn't work very well. Okay, let's do some quick answers on the discussion, and the lesson will be done. Jesus' birth is not recorded until the New Testament, yet the entire Bible is about Jesus. How is this fact demonstrated in this lesson? Yeah, the prophecy in Genesis 3:15. The prophecy is about Jesus. This whole book is about Jesus. All the Bible is about him. You know, one thing we can know is the Old Testament, if you wanted to cover the Old Testament in one statement, he's coming. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he's here. Acts through Revelation, he's coming back. He's coming, he's here, he's coming back. And if we can remember the Bible in those 3 things in the different ways, we would do a lot better to formulate that. Okay, Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent for their sin. Who is at fault? Who is at fault in our lives when we sin? Yeah, they all were, yeah. You know, Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed Satan, and the serpent didn't have a leg to stand on. Dum-dum. Yeah. Anyway. But yeah, that's what happened, I guess. Number 3, Cain asked God the question, am I my brother's keeper? What do you think the answer was, yes or no? Explain why you think so. Was he his brother's keeper? Yeah, he was responsible for his brother because, you know, he certainly should have had better thought about him. Of course, the reason why I answered that, he'd already killed him and buried him. He knew where his brother was, and certainly that was wrong. Is it possible to remain righteous in a sin-sick world? How? How can we look? Who can we look for an example? Jesus, we can look for an example. We can look at some other people. Who are some people in our text tonight? Noah. Noah was a righteous man in a sin-sick world. Enoch. You've also got Abel. Abel was good. And so yeah, there's people that can be righteous in a world covered up by sin. And it's possible to do that. Pride is a dangerous sin. It causes people to ignore God's plans and create their own. The Tower of Babel is an example of this. How do people still try to thwart God's plans today? We don't have all night to talk about that one, do we? Yeah. People try in every way to thwart God's plans. You know, my comment is, if you want to see God laugh, tell him what you plan to do. I've heard that before. That's not original with me. But yeah, if you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans. Because, you know, certainly God has other things in mind. And God can change those things. Anyway, next week we're going to look at the patriarchs, which are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We'll look at the chapters of 12 through 36 and look at them and some of the stories related to them. And we'll look at that portion of the book of Genesis. Tonight, if you're not a Christian or not a child of God, we want to give you the opportunity. Give you the opportunity to become one. We'd like for you to do that. If you need to respond for prayers, for strength or encouragement, we want to give you that opportunity as well. If you're watching us online and would like to reach out to us and study with us and study about becoming a Christian, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at barrickvillechurch@gmail.com. If you're in person and would like to respond to the gospel, we'd love to help you out. We'd love to study with you. We'd love to talk with you. Would you please come while together we stand and sing.